Okay, so we're going to talk about this journey that I took. I mean, it was a phenomenal opportunity, actually, to travel and research for a couple of years. Certainly at a point where, after running Learning Without Frontiers for 7 years, which any of you who got involved in any of those events and that think tank, was quite a provocative and challenging time. This was quite a new experience to go and find out what people were doing at the actual coalface. Before I get into it, though, I want to take you on my own, a little bit of my own personal learning journey. The kid there on your right well, actually the bloke on there, the ugly one, is 10 times older than that one, and that one's 5. As you can see, though it's okay, the maths is like 50 and 5. Boom, boom. You can see I grew into my ears. Do you know what I mean? But there's a reason why I put those guys up there. So 5 was when, by law, my parents handed me over to the state apparatus for the education system. I entered school. I actually left 10 years later. I left at 15. I was a bit of a naughty boy and got caught. Sort of entrepreneurship, I think, is probably the easier term, combined with my interest in organic chemistry. So I'm sure you can work that out. But that wasn't the end of my educational journey. That was my end of my formal engagement at the time in education. But I then went on to live in a squat. I then moved out of a squat. I ended up working for a university for a little while. Got involved in writing software for an old scheme in the 80s called the Micros in Schools scheme. And then went on to run a number of fast growth technology, entertainment, and education publishing businesses. So I've had an interesting career both in the music industry, feature films and video games, but also in educational technology. In the last 10 years, running Learning Without Frontiers, trying to bring together people from all of those different sectors, because I thought the conversation around transformation and positive change or revolution in education would require different constituencies of people talking to each other. And that should include the academic community, the education community, as well as video game designers, filmmakers, and storytellers, and so forth. And that brought me to where I am today. So Learning Reimagined then. This was a 2-year program, which was qualitative. There was no sort of flip charts or kind of taking those sort of quantitative type things. It was a qualitative study over 2 years of different parts of the world, seeing the impact that digital platforms had on the way we learn, the way we live, the way we communicate. It was funded by the Qatar Foundation, as Matt explained earlier, through the World Innovation Summit for Education, which I'm very grateful to. So there he is again. My colleague there, Nusha Tavakolian, also left school at 16, funny enough, but is Iran's most acclaimed young photographer. She's recently won the Carmignac Photojournalism Award in 2014 and then promptly returned it because they wanted to edit her work. Her first 8 publications in Iran were banned, so you can see how, with this interesting past, that we got on famously. Nusha came along as our photographic director on this journey which took us over 120,000 miles to 36 cities, 18 countries, over a relatively short amount of time. The point of this was to really look at how technology is transforming. We also got to meet a number of thought leaders and thinkers in the debate around education. So people such as Sir Ken Robinson, of course Liverpool is his birthplace, Noam Chomsky, Seth Godin, Julia Gillard, Sugata Mitra, and many other luminaries and leading thinkers in educational transformation. The point was we were trying to understand how the connected society was transforming learning. And by connected society, we don't just mean people connected to the internet and using MOOCs and so forth, but actually people all over the world talking to each other as we go through a transformation within the educational systems globally. But what do we mean by transformation? We've been talking about transformation for many years. Certainly 30 years ago, when I got involved in educational technology, I thought that technology would profoundly change learning. 30 years later, in a sense, I'm still waiting. But transformation, to some extent, and its bedfellow, is revolution. And I wonder what we mean by revolution. True revolutions transform society. for generations. Are we ready for a change in society? Are we ready for a real transformation in education? Because that indicates a change to the status quo, and some would imagine that education's role, like many other structures in society, such as religion or mass media or the judicial system, are there to maintain the status quo. So transformation is an interesting term. And a revolutionary, Fidel Castro, say what you will, he did put education and healthcare at the top of his list when he came to power in Cuba. So what is the new status quo? And so we're going to come to this as we go through this journey. One of the questions that we asked as we were going around the world and meeting thought leaders and meeting practitioners, whether it was in a refugee camp in Syria, up a mountain in rural China after an earthquake, or in rural Bihar after driving for 6 hours to a place that was media dark, or in a school in Silicon Valley or an office in the boardroom of Google, we said, what is school for? I've got a couple of answers here. First up is Seth Godin.
Public education is only 150 years old, and we built it with a specific function in mind. We built the educational system to train kids to sit still long enough to work in a factory. That's what it's for, to create compliant, obedient factory workers. So the question we need to ask is, what is school for now? We're not asking that question. Parents, administrators, taxpayers are not asking the question, what is school for? I have an opinion. I think what it's not for is to create more factory workers, because we don't need more factory workers. I think what we need to do is teach kids two things. One, how to solve interesting problems, and two, how to lead. And yet if you look at just about any public school in North America or Europe, we're not teaching that. We're teaching kids how to do well on the test instead.
And of course there are
Noam Chomsky.
Sharp differences on this matter. There's the traditional an interpretation that comes from the Enlightenment, which holds that the highest goal in life is to inquire and create, to search the riches of the past, try to internalize the parts of them that are significant to you, carry that quest for understanding further in your own way. Purpose of education, from that point of view, is just to help people determine how to learn on their own. It's you, the learner, who is going to achieve in the course of education, and it's really up to you what you'll master, where you'll go, how you'll use it, how you'll go on to produce something new and exciting for yourself, maybe for others. That's one concept of education. The other concept is essentially indoctrination. People have the idea that from childhood, young people have to be placed into a framework in which they'll follow orders, accept existing frameworks, not challenge, and so on. And this is often quite explicit. So, for example, after the...
So there's a couple of different views there, and of course we could go on, and there's a large debate around what education and what school is for, and it'll become apparent why we're asking that question again soon, because indeed many of us would regard, indeed the first speaker was talking about how society is changing, particularly under digital technologies. And so if we're thinking about transformation, and we're thinking about a change to the status quo, we need to have an understanding, or at least a dialogue, about what that new status quo looks like before we can understand what school is for. Many people would also argue that school and education is to deliver human capital to an economic development plan. Certainly there are nations, certainly OECD, for example, would regard that as one of the goals. which may be what Chomsky was talking about in terms of indoctrination. In 1971, Ivan Illich, in his book Deschooling Society, which if you haven't read in a while, I think it's always worth reading, suggests that school is an advertising agency to make us believe that we need a society as it is. So in a sense, Ivan Illich is also suggesting a fairly Marxist view of education in terms of a superstructure, almost a matrix-like quality that actually forms part of your consciousness. And many writers, social political theorists, Gramsci, Bourdieu, and so on, have also talked about that particular way of looking at education. So as we had Seth Godin. He had a very much almost slightly Ayn Rand kind of view of education, in the sense of, okay, we need education to do now is to provide young people with the skills to solve interesting problems, he said, and how to lead. Chomsky, of course, was far more black and white. You know, it's either in the form of the Enlightenment, learning how to learn, learning for the joy of learning, personal inquiry, searching the riches of the past, deciding that things that you might be interested in, perhaps useful and interesting to somebody else, versus this idea of indoctrination, putting young people into this framework, strapping young people with debt to maintain their complicity and their compliance and their obedience. And I wonder really whether this is a new conversation. Of course, if we go back to 1902, John Dewey, The Child and the Curriculum, he talks also then about this sort of false dichotomy, if you like, one school of thought around education, saying that it's for the curriculum is what drives the education process, and the curriculum drives the outcome and the means and so forth, the ingesting and the distribution of content and the testing of that content, versus the self-realization of the child. So these debates, these conversations, even though in 2015, are not new. This is a debate that's been going on for over 100 years, in fact. And you'll see why I'm raising this later in the talk, because indeed we're now asking these questions again, particularly when we look at how technology is being deployed in education. So I went traveling. They're all mine, by the way. And I want to tell you about the sort of 6 discoveries, the 6 learnings that I had, and the conclusions within the report that you saw Matt holding earlier. These are essentially around context, environment, engagement, technology, assessment, and future. So we're going to go through these right now. So first of all, context. As I mentioned, I was traveling to very diverse countries, diverse environments, diverse circumstances. So September 2013, when the US was pointing missiles at Damascus, we were in Syria on the border at a refugee camp to understand how education is delivered and the importance of education in a politically difficult circumstance. We went out to Ghana in West Africa, where young people were being given, children in primary schools were all given Amazon Kindles, very simple paper-white Kindle devices. And this was transformative in their situation. And the reason was, we imagine that we need to use iPads and tablets and internet-connected devices and so forth, but the problem that they were trying to solve in Ghana was the fact that they, as a post-colonial society, its school pedagogy was based around books. And indeed, even university pedagogy is based around books within African states as a result of particularly colonization. The problem there is, as a consequence, books are very expensive to distribute. The cost of import duties, the cost of moving them around. And as a result, they have a pedagogy based around books in these schools, but couldn't deliver the lessons. The intervention was using very low cost, very inexpensive, the sort of $50 type Kindles that deliver it on a paperwhite screen, something you could read in broad daylight. And the battery, because of power outages, could last for over a week. The result was that young children then ended up having over hundreds of books, which they could have with them all times and take them home. The result there being that the teacher could plan lessons knowing that all of the children had the books. So that for them was transformative. In another case in Bihar, in India, we traveled to a village which was what we call media dark, which means no newspapers, no radio, no television, very little power, no sanitation, 100% illiteracy in these places. And we were working with BBC Media Action, who were delivering a maternal healthcare program using very basic feature phones. Again, from a Western perspective, we think of smartphones and we think of iPads and we think of tablets and we think of high-speed broadband internet and so forth, all of which would have not been useful in these villages, where literacy, as I said, was almost zero. These were the ASHAs, the healthcare workers, were using a basic feature phone with, I mean, actually more basic than you can imagine. These were phones with labels that said things like Samsung, as opposed to Samsung, or Noia. These were knockoff phones using interactive voice response. The point I'm trying to drive at there is that transformation, we talk about transformation in education systems, it's often contextual. Some of the technologies we might use in the Western world don't deploy terribly well in some of these circumstances. And indeed, sometimes we get carried away with the technology and we imagine transformation to occur just when we add technology. Environment was also something critical. So the schools that I visited, whether it was in Amman in Jordan, or in China in Beijing, or in San Diego, the environment that we were working in, and actually indeed in the university we are here, the environment says something about the expectation of the student as well as the teaching body that are engaged with the student. The schools that seemed to work the best were those where you couldn't really tell, where it was impossible to see where the classroom ended and the common room started. We also had teachers who were co-teaching, and the notion of a 1 hour or a 2 hour lesson had been abandoned in favor of project-based learning. So in schools like High Tech High, for example, in San Diego, we saw this idea of a problem-based curriculum, so topic-based as opposed to subject-based, and de-siloed. So you didn't have in high school, and these were state-funded, these weren't private schools, these were charter schools, for example, or state schools. And we saw this happening, as I say, RDFZ, Jishan School in Beijing, High Tech High in San Diego, Quest to Learn in New York, ESA Academy in Bolton. We begin to see this pattern emerging of environments that were built around collaboration, environments that were built around de-siloing the curriculum. And that sets a particular expectation amongst all members. You can imagine these kids, they had an idea of where they wanted to go after that school, after that experience. And it makes you wonder, if an environment sets the expectation for young people, then if you look at some of the environments that have a less ambitious view, is it deliberate that they're setting expectations for those young people for their particular economic situation? I think it's worth considering this issue around environment and how, if we are, what is a school for? If the school is to produce office workers or factory workers, maybe that is effectively challenging the environment, as opposed to where we want young people to go next. Engagement. This sort of sounds like an obvious point. How, do we have students that are engaged? But the point I'm really getting to here is actually engagement amongst the teaching body. What we're seeing, of course, is that we understand pressures on young people, but we're also seeing now many education systems, many schools, many universities, all based on league tables and conformance, even amongst the teacher body. So rather than looking purely at student dropout, I think we need to start looking at teacher dropout, educator dropout from the system. Wherever we travelled, in all the schools and the universities that we visited, it was quite clear that where the magic happened was where you had an engaged, passionate educator. We went into some schools, for example, that were trying to impress us with their technology. Dubai was a good example, where we introduced to a science lesson, where they had the science lesson took place in a 3D studio. So you had a projection screen, and an amazing teacher that was giving this lesson on chemistry, and then stopped the lesson halfway through and said, right, we're going to go to the 3D presentation. And all these kids put on their 3D specs. It was like something from the Jetsons. I mean, it did look very, very cool. But the technology added absolutely nothing to the lesson. I'm not anti-technology, but in this case, what was really happening, you could have taken away the classroom, you could have taken away the technology, you could have put it outside. This teacher would have still given a fantastic lesson that engaged all the students. And I brought this to attention, and really, I think she'd been so aware of the environment that she put in, she'd forgotten the fact that when you strip it all down, it's one person talking to another person, and that engagement is vital. Unfortunately, though, with pressures put on educators all over the world, we're seeing massive fallout and massive dropout of educators from the system. I think the point is like once you put educators through a system, almost a factory system of effectively getting young people going through an education system, processing them, having a quality control measurement at the end in the form of an assessment, and the reward on educators is based around their ability to get kids through tests as opposed to being innovative in their teaching, leads to this burnout and leads to this disengagement. And it's a serious problem. In the US, only 30, in a recent Gallup survey last year, just 30% of US K through 12 teaching workforce were engaged with their work. This led the other 70% to taking 2.3 million extra days as absenteeism, leading to a suboptimal learning environment for the children. And the issue really is that in processing teaching, in having a system which is moving young people through at a clip, testing and so forth, education is seen as a delivery system. And it's not. It's a reductionist idea, the idea that teaching and learning is simply about installing some content and then testing it to make sure it's been received and understood is a reductionist version of what teaching is about. Teaching isn't FedEx, in other words. I don't know when we started confusing teaching with FedEx, as a delivery system, but certainly this is how it's beginning to appear in the sort of systemized views, and we'll come to why that is in a little while. So I want to look at technology. So as I said earlier, 30 years ago, when I first started getting involved in the education world and designing educational software and so forth, I, like many people, and people that I was involved with at the time were people like Seymour Papert with the beginning of Logo and so forth, was that this would be this profound change. And as I said earlier, 30 years later, certainly within formal education, I'm still waiting to see that change. And I think we hit a sort of a crossroads. And I found this with Learning Without Frontiers, where we tried to have this new conversation about how technology could liberate, empower, and amplify educators and amplify their capability of learners. And that was a conversation I thought we were having. And then I suddenly realized there was a whole other conversation that was going on, which was this idea of using technology in an industrial context, which was using technology to eke out ever greater efficiencies, to use technology in this sort of sense of removing some of the craft, to be able to say, okay, well, we can use technology to use adaptive learning and algorithms. We can remove the teacher, the educator, from that loop, this variable, and then the whole thing can be processed. So rather than using technology to create this revolution, this transformation of the learning experience, we ended up with something that was freezing it in ice. Kind of reminded me of those walkways that we have in airports. Do you know the ones I mean? And educational technology tends to be used like that, where you can either actually just go slowly or you can go fast. But the point is you always end up at the same destination. And that might have been fine back in the 50s, where we wanted to get a certain group of kids coming out with these qualifications so they could be good on factories or good at offices and so forth. But today, with some very large challenges ahead, do we want everyone to end up at the same destination? Or can we use technology for young people to go in a variety of different areas? And I have to say, perhaps that's also a personal issue. My education was achieved as leaving, was actually hopping onto a train and going into London as a young man and shoplifting books from foils, because I had a severe interest in certain subjects. But I think the internet, because the internet didn't exist then, I think now we have the opportunity to use technology in a much more exciting way. And we're not seeing as much of that as perhaps we should. So let's see what Kerry Facer at University of Bristol has to say.
Massive investments in technology is that some of them are going to be beneficial. There's no doubt that sort of thing changes what it's possible to do. But at the same time, unless people have had the fundamental question, the fundamental conversation about what you think education is for, this stuff is essentially pointless.
So I think what she's saying there is that technology and transformation, it's what I was saying earlier. If we don't have a goal, we don't have where is the revolution, where is the transformation going to, what does transformation look like, then it's very difficult in terms of applying technology to learning. Indeed, there's very little evidence to show how technology actually, the learning outcomes have improved through the application of technology. And I'm sure that's a conversation for debate. But it doesn't seem to be commensurate with the amount of money being spent, because typically, if all we're using is technology to get to the same, like the conveyor belt type thing, then we just get there a little bit faster. And if that's the transformation that we're looking for, which is the same education system and the same assessment systems, just faster, then maybe. But I think we're missing a trick here, especially when the needs of our education systems have changed dramatically, in my opinion. Just about a year ago, Matthew Hancock, when he was the enterprise minister in the UK, went on the front page of a newspaper, city newspaper in London, saying about the end of teaching, how technology would be used to impart knowledge, and therefore teachers and educators could take a back seat. And he said this like it was a good thing. It was genuinely a good thing. I mean, I was horrified at this idea. This is not the conversation I wanted to have about technology. And he's talking about things like big data, how we can collect data about a large body of students, and then from that data we can analyze and then use algorithms to take the data and then work out how the learner might want to know more about this or that or the other. It sounds wonderful if you say it quickly, until you realize that big data really tells us the what, it doesn't tell us the why. And the idea of entrusting a computer to provide the education, and to take the lecturer or the educator out of the loop, fills me with horror. For the simple reason that we lose diversity, we lose innovation of the innovation that diversity brings in thinking by entrusting all these to algorithms on a computer. And plus, we also run the risk of algorithmic bias. Now, of course, what I mean by algorithmic bias is algorithms like newspapers are written by humans. Full of, they have their own biases within those. Sometimes they're benign, sometimes they're not. But the bias is nevertheless. And I think we need to understand that in the technology world, that it is a built environment. And the difference is because it's becoming less visible. And by less visible, you might not know why it's saying left or right. The issue there is if we entrust all of the education system to a set of algorithms, the collateral damage, the number of people, because it's a bit like when you're using Google Maps, eventually it's going to take you past all the pizza restaurants. You're not going to have the experience of getting lost and finding something you didn't know you liked. I think this is quite a worrying trend.
Orange, peace, happy, joy, fun, because I do not work as hard as King is beautiful. Gamma everyone just begins, because morality ought never, in any circumstances, to be rational. Orange, peace, work, happiness. Open your eyes. Wake up.
Anyone want to step what that's a story about? Anyone know? Film, book? Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. The reason why I put that clip together, it was based around this notion of what's become a personalized learning, of algorithmic learning. The idea that if you have the right amount of technology involved, it's quite simple relatively simple to effectively get the outputs that you want. So it's by having a closed-loop system, the idea of creating an output, in this case, an alpha. But the point that I was trying to make was, with this approach, so I completely forgot where I was going there. Apologies. Hold on. My point with this was, with an algorithmic environment, is that the control and the outputs, you end up having less diversity. This really comes down to a gentleman called Frederick Taylor, who in the turn of the last century introduced a scientific manufacturing method. It was really about how you manufacture spoons or cars, or you get a consistent level of output from your factories. The idea was to convert craft manufacturing, craft labor, into mass manufacturing. That might work terribly well. It might work well, and indeed has worked well in the production line manufacturing. But in an educational system, we're not producing, we're not outputting spoons or cars or standardized products. And yet, Frederick Taylor, you'll find his involvement across the board and corresponded with many of the educators of the beginning of the last century. And a lot of those rules, this is a scientific management, this idea of feeding data from the production line to management has actually crept through to today. And I think one of the issues that we have with some of the technology in education is the ability to use that command and control. So having data coming from the production line to de-skill and de-professionalize the education profession. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not at all anti-technology, and I'm not suggesting that we should abandon it. In fact, I'm very positive about education, but I'm just wanting to point out that what I've seen here is these very different routes. One which is using technology to liberate the learner, liberate the educator. The other which is to try and contain it as a sort of production line of effectiveness to get people through a test very, very quickly. I don't think teachers will be replaced by technology, however, but I do think that those agile teachers who use technology well will replace those who don't. And I also would like to say that education plus technology doesn't always equal transformation. It can do, providing we understand where we want to go in our transformation, what the end game is, what the new status quo looks like.
The sense in which that's true of testing. I mean, there's a kind of benign view of testing, which is that it fulfills necessary purposes in relation to keeping track of standards, accountability, and in providing certification, and qualifications for progress through the system. So, there's a benign way of looking at it and saying, well, it meets those important purposes in education, and there's something to be said about that. What's also true is it's a massively profitable enterprise for publishers. It's one of the engines of the education economy. And the debate isn't about should we get rid of testing, but can we produce more interesting, more expensive forms of it. I mean, in America, states spend billions of dollars on testing systems. It's a big business. And so it makes it difficult to have a reasoned conversation about it with people because there are lots of vested interests. Like in the environment, a lot of the arguments about oil and coal aren't being held in some neutral ethical space. In the environment, there are massive vested interests who don't want to be looking at clean source of energy because their profits lie in the existing source of energy, and they'd rather keep it this way until they're exhausted, and then they'll look for some other way of making a profit. That's not being cynical, that's just a matter of fact. It's how the markets work. And there's a market in education for these things. So when we talk about testing, it's a rather complicated picture. If you look at it from a purely educational point of view, as opposed to an ideological point of view or a commercial point of view, education can function perfectly well without tests of the sort that we're currently used to. And it may be able to function even better in future without them because, one purpose of testing is to monitor students' progress. Well, there are better ways of doing that than from standardized competitive testing. There are teacher reports, there are peer group reports, there are portfolios that can be given. If we're just interested in making sure that people are making adequate progress, I mean, the occasional diagnostic test is fine. But there are better ways of doing it than sitting people down ritually and routinely and
So assessment is, just to flip back on the previous slide, this was something that we came up against repeatedly as we traveled around. We saw many universities, many schools, many places of learning where we saw genuinely exciting, transformative practice. The issue that we came across was that you would see these great environments, whether it was, I say, in any of the locations that we were at. The conversation would then end up with but. And this was when, in terms of scaling that practice, so for example in High-Tech High, which was, as an environment, as mentioned earlier, was one where, when we were in the offices of Google in Silicon Valley the day before, and in IDEO, the design company in Palo Alto and in San Francisco, going into High-Tech High, the environment was very similar. You can see the expectation, if you will, of the young people of the school was for their future. But then we get to the point where the kids then have to be, or the students have to be trained to pass exams. These exams and these assessments, these high-stake assessments that we've become so familiar with over the years, and indeed many of us went through, probably except for me. But nevertheless, this was as I mentioned, the sort of tail that wagged the dog of learning. This is what is freezing that transformation, because despite talking about 21st century skills, we've heard those kind of conversations about collaboration, about creativity, about communication, about critical thinking. This wasn't apparent when you came to a room that looks like that, where everyone's sitting, 3 feet away, and you're not allowed to collaborate. In fact, there's specific rules about cheating. You go to high schools in the UK. My daughter's high school, there's a big sign outside the examination room saying, no smartphones, no talking, no digital computers. It's like the 21st century never happened. And I'm wondering why. The Victorians, in a way, had it right. They were very progressive by our standards, certainly in schools. The Victorians allowed, of course, to use Victorian technology in the examination room. You had your pen, you had your paper. That was allowed. And yet today, of course, in an examination room like this, you can practically be frisked to make sure that you're not carrying anything from your century, anything from the working environment you're going to enter after you finish the exams. And I wonder what would happen if we decided that it was mandatory in an examination to have your connected internet device. Imagine in a secondary school, A-levels or your GCSEs, where you have to have a connected device. That's part of it. Imagine how then teaching would change. If that was, if it was, you were told you had to collaborate, you were told that you could phone your mum, you could find an expert and so forth, and you could, rather than trying to do a siloed examination, you had to solve a problem collectively, collaboratively, and that's how you would be assessed. So I just wonder if something was to change, maybe that would have a trickle-down effect in terms of education. Perhaps secondary schools aren't this sort of conveyor belt to university. And perhaps university isn't a conveyor belt to a job. Perhaps there is a learning for the love of learning.
The sense in which that's true.
I think the problem is that we take parents seriously when we hear them say, I just want my kid to get these qualifications, or I just want my kid to get into this university. And what we hear is that they therefore want an education system that is about exams and is about results. I genuinely think that what the parents mean in those situations is, I want to get security for my kids, I want to get well-being for my kids, I want them to be able to live well in the world, I want them to be okay when they're in old age. And I think the mistake that we've made is we keep having the conversations about the proxies, the exam results, the certification, and not about the more fundamental questions, which is, what does it take to live well in the world? What is it that we're going to need?
So Kerry is there talking about our examination results. Are they the proxies? We operate. I do myself with my own children, operate in a sort of collusion around grades. You know, if my 14-year-old daughter comes home and says she got an A or a B, I'm well done, congratulations. If she's talking about C's or D's, and you know, we have a little chat. So despite whether this is actually going to, you know, whether these grades actually genuinely mean anything to her future, whether they are really testing what she learns, what she can do, what her experiences are. Quite often, of course, many of us will have experience. I mean, the exams, I mean, a case in point, during the last break, she spent an awful lot of time in her bedroom. I didn't inquire too much. I mean, she's a teenager, blah, blah, blah. But I said, well, what are you doing? I haven't seen you. She goes, well, I'm revising. I said, well, what for? She goes, for tests. And I'm thinking, that's quite sad, isn't it? It's you know, the excitement and that she had in primary education has been diminished where she spends her entire secondary school career revising for tests. And what she meant by revising was memorizing a whole bunch of stuff to regurgitate at a given time. And we'll almost certainly forget. You know, we could do a quick test here and see who can do a quadratic equation if you like, but I don't like audience participation. I'm sure you don't either. But what I'm saying is a lot of that stuff doesn't have that sort of relevance. And the stuff that she learns, the stuff that she really knows, is the stuff that she actually does and practices and discovers and so forth. And we don't have that because we have this assessment system right at the end. And I think to some extent universities are culpable in this because of the way many set these kind of entrance and so forth. Maybe there's another way of assessing. I know when I was running high-tech businesses, and you know, I ran businesses with 200-300 employees, and I built those myself. And I wasn't interested in the qualifications. What I was interested in is what they can do. And these were tech businesses. So, for example, if I was hiring a software engineer, I would say, well, listen, I'd ask her to show me what you've made, as opposed to show me your certificate. Now, don't get me wrong, I would hate to come to a university and say all this degree stuff is nonsense, because it's absolutely not. Despite the fact that I left school early, I spent an awful lot of my time in universities. I found mentors. You know, Chomsky, for example, has been a friend of mine for 20 years because I was interested in something he wrote, so I went to find him. The difference is I did all that for free and didn't end up with £60,000 worth of debt at the end of it. But I think this area around assessment is something that we all need to consider. How do we assess the important things? Do we need to assess them in this sort of the way that we've been doing? I'm not sure it's entirely relevant to the future. I'm not sure it's an entirely good way of understanding what somebody can do. And I think that is what is holding things up in terms of transformation and disruption in education. It's not technology, it's assessment. And my point is if we want technology to do amazing things, which it can, and it absolutely can, and you're here with a technology company which is in working to enable that. But at the end of the day, technology is only a tool, and you need to know what the objective is. And I think that objective is being held back by assessment. So my point is transformation or revolution in education must begin with a change in assessment. And until the education economy, which is based on assessments, I think as Sir Ken Robinson was saying earlier, it is a business. Billions of dollars are spent in assessment. It's not a neutral space. The business model of many universities is based around assessment. There are large companies that own the awarding bodies and the content you need to learn in order to pass that. Until that industry is disrupted, and you hear a lot from technology companies and Silicon Valley talking about disruption and transformation, that, to me, is the key part that we need to transform. We need to look at how we assess differently, and that starts with universities and schools. I worked in Canada at a 5-day summit. It was almost like a reality TV show. We worked during the day with 39 other very clever people. I think I was there as a court jester. But our plan, the mission that was sent at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo was to come up with a blueprint for learning in 2030. And we ended up saying about, in 2030 we would remove high-stakes assessment from secondary schools. If you're interested in that work, I'll send you to learning2030.org, where you can contribute to that work. It's really genuinely worth looking at. But as I say, if we want to see transformation, we want to see this revolution, which I'm sure many of us believe in, this new way of learning, this new way of teaching, then we have to start with assessment. We have to look at that. We have to disrupt that. So the future. I spent a lot of my career, certainly in the education and technology career, but in other industries as well, listening to people on stages like this talk about this thing called the future. And you have futurologists and so forth, and I'm sure some of you have heard some of those talks. And they're really exciting, and the future is so bright. We have to wear this young lady's shades. It's all about, the physical economy disappearing, and we all actually have to code. We all have to be on social media, we all have to be digital, and so forth. And that may be true. Maybe we're looking at a future where there's no work and everything's done by a robot and there's cars that drive you and ferry you everywhere. Maybe that is true. But I'm not entirely convinced that we know that for certain. Because to some extent, we've fallen into a trap of technological determinism or even economic determinism, or certainly an unholy alliance between the two of them, where you're seeing very large valuations of technology companies. I mean, Uber, for example, is worth more than the entire taxi business of the entire world. How is that possible? How was Instagram worth $19 billion when it had a fraction of the employees of, say, British Telecom? I'm wondering a lot about those things. But it's this idea that technology is what shapes society, or the economy is what shapes society, I think is fallacious, certainly running out of steam at the moment. And I think when we think about the future, we need to think about, well, what do we really know about the future? Because that might determine what school is for now. I think we knew, as Seth Godin was saying earlier, back 100 years ago, when we were going from agriculture to urban and to industrial manufacturing and so forth, we had a good idea of what the output might be. Whether we like the idea or not, this idea of delivering human capital to the economic development plan, like Singapore, for example. But what is it now? What does the future really hold? What could we, rather than just thinking purely about coding and all these kinds of jobs, what does the future look like? Are we really happy with this idea that democracy is being driven away by technology? Do we want to have what we call human agency? Our involvement in deciding what the future looks like. And these are things that we do know about this century. And I haven't sort of pulled this out of out of the air. I could have said that, what if an asteroid hits the Earth, an extinction level event type thing, what would we do? But I thought, let's stick to facts, stick to stuff that we know that's going to happen this century, when our children, the children that are entering the education system today, what are they going to face? Because that might change some of how we manage our society and what our role as educators and what our role as universities will be. So we know that population, from the last figures that were announced at the UNGA last year, population of this planet will be 11 billion people, conservatively, at the end of this century. Just to put that into some kind of sense, the African continent will have over 4 billion people. That's a lot of people. We're having a general election, aren't we, in a month or two's time, and there's one particular party actually a lot of the parties talking about immigration. What a huge problem that's going to be. But what happens when you've got 4 billion people on that continent, and of course there's this other thing called climate change happening. We know that's a thing. What happens when the people in the equatorial regions can no longer feed themselves, have no access to medicine, crops don't grow, there's drought, there's heat, there's flooding? What do? They move. And we're worried about, a few Eastern Europeans. This is going to be mass movement of people. Are we preparing ourselves for those challenges? Antibiotic resistance, we know, is a thing. Ideology is also a thing, and it will continue to be a thing for quite a while. Now, my point is not to turn this into a sort of dystopia. I'm actually very positive, very optimistic about the human condition. All I'm doing is saying, look, these are some challenges. These are the elephants in the room. That when we go around asking what is school for, these are the elephants in the room that I was having conversations with wherever I was. I was sitting around a fire in Jordan, in the Jordan-Syrian border, talking about these issues. I was talking about these issues in China, both up a mountain where kids don't have food in their stomach to go to school, as well as in urban Beijing. I was having this conversation in San Diego. I mean, these are things that educators are talking about. When we talk about STEM, we hear a lot about the idea of STEM shortage, science, technology, engineering, and maths. Well, the issue there is there's an argument about whether we're short or not, because what they're saying is we've got enough mathematicians selling advertising space for Google. And if they're not selling advertising space for Google, they're working for the NSA. It's enough. But what we do is we don't have a fair distribution of these skills. Where are the scientists, engineers, mathematicians working in the equatorial regions? We don't have a single university in the African continent in the top 100. I think this is a problem. So when we start thinking about what education is for, what schooling is for, we might want to think about some of these issues. And then we would wonder whether GDP, gross domestic product, is really the right key performance indicator, see what I did there, for education. Is that how we value our investments? When we are saddling young people with tuition fees and university debt, is basing this around GDP the right way forward? I think when we get to the end of this century, I don't want to be the one at the end of the century where my grandchildren say to me, it was all about global competitiveness. It was all about being better or more powerful or richer than the other country. Maybe the traditional borders that we have today are not relevant. Maybe we need young people, the next generation, the ones that are coming through now, the ones that are leaving university now, to think differently about society in the future. Education, of course, can be a sort of a passport to a better life. But, of course, then who is controlling the border? The borders are still controlled. We don't have free movement of people. We don't have free movement of intellect. And as I say, I think we can solve these issues. I think we need to understand the role, of course, educators have in this. Because what the future looks like, what happens in this century, is absolutely down to us. Whether we have drought, whether we have water, whether we distribute food so we don't have this sort of inequity that you're seeing on the side, whether we have peace or war. These are things that we have equity. They aren't done to us. So I think if we just leave this conversation to governments and industrialists and Silicon Valley, I think we're impoverishing ourselves. And our role as educators, our role as universities and schools, plays a very important part in what our future looks like. So I think that, in summary, the purpose of education, the purpose of schooling, is to equip our children with skills to reimagine society. I don't think we can transform education, not in a massive positive transformation, unless we transform society, unless we change it, unless we create a new status quo, unless we understand what that status quo looks like. The status quo looks like what we have today, where a minority have a lot and the majority have less, and that's how it operates. I think that might not work. Do you know what I mean? I think we need to think about these things differently, because I think as a global society, and what I found on my journey, was these problems are big, but if we lift them together, they can be solved. And they'll be solved in universities, and they'll be solved in schools, and they'll be solved in families. And this point about reimagining society is so they can meet the challenges of their generation. And if I'm wrong, and they create a better world for nothing, then so what? Thank you for your time.